Welcome to the Old Guy AI podcast, brought to you by MongoDB. And now, here's Scott Sanchez and Pete Johnson.
Hello there. I'm Pete Johnson, and with me, as always, is my friend Scott Sanchez. And Scott, for today's icebreaker, I was at an executive briefing center earlier this week in Silicon Valley. Do you have a favorite EBC?
I will say that in a land long ago and far away, you and I worked for a small company called Cisco,
We did.
and they at the time had what I would consider a truly world-class briefing center. And I thought that they always just did a really, really good job. I spent like months of my life in the briefing center with customers and partners, but it was well designed, it was well run, it was just sort of everything you wanted in a briefing center. How about you?
Well, I liked that one. I didn't spend as much time there as you did, but I liked that it sort of had the product showcase where you could walk around and you could actually touch these things, or you could see some company history. My favorite only because of the circumstances. So I did 20 years at HP. The last meeting that I did at HP Corporate, Building 20 on Page Mill Road in Palo Alto, was in January of 13. I happened to be at the first meeting in what was then the new EBC at HP Corporate. And I think I can say this because I don't think anybody cares anymore. It was with Workday, who was looking for some alternatives to AWS to run their SaaS, and they did not choose HP Cloud, which I think is not news to anybody. But Meg did a pop-in. Meg Whitman was the CEO at the time, and that's always cool when the CEO comes and does a pop-in, especially when she's already a billionaire. So yeah, that was my favorite, only because it was kind of cool to be able to say you went to the first meeting there.
Yeah, piece of history.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about AI. As always, a lot has happened in the last week, and let's start taking this stuff in reverse chronological order. So yesterday, you sent me an article about Apple and rumors about them pivoting to Gemini. Why don't you talk about that?
I would be excited if they used anything that worked. Um, I I can't believe like how disappointing Apple's foray into AI capabilities has been. Right? They toughed it up in such a big way last
Yeah.
year. I went out and bought the 16 Pro Max. I was due for an upgrade anyway, so I justified it that way, right? But it's so bad. Like a year later, I'm running beta 9 of the next iOS, and it's still just so bad. It's like using ChatGPT 3 on a bad day. And I really, whether it's Gemini or anything else that's useful, I really, really hope that in this next version of releases from Apple, we do see something more useful.
I wonder if it's gotten as bad as they've lost the window of opportunity. I did a LinkedIn post a couple of weeks ago where I had an idea for something, and I was driving to my optometrist, which happens to be, for historical reasons, on the other end of the Cincinnati suburban landscape. I live in the southern suburbs. This place is in the northern suburbs. As I'm passing the Bengals Stadium on the riverfront, I had an idea. I opened up Claude on my phone and I dictated, "Hey, go research XYZ in deep research mode," and I did it completely with voice. By the time I got out of my optometrist appointment, I had a great report. And when I got home, I could access that report on Claude Desktop and I could import it into Workspace or wherever I wanted. So how are they going to improve on that? Like, does it matter that I had to push, 2 buttons instead of one on the side? Like, have they missed the opportunity, I guess is what I'm asking.
I would be happy if I could ask Siri to just like create a calendar entry for me, and it
Yeah.
did. Or to call someone or create a note or a reminder, like the basics, the most basic stuff that like every free app on the planet now has become really good at.
Yeah.
One of the most valuable companies ever to exist in mankind can't get the basics right. And so it would be very encouraging to see them going outside of their comfort zone potentially and partnering with Google, which they obviously do for browsers and other things, um, but but it can only go up from here is kind of how I'm looking at it. But I do
Yeah.
very much agree with you that like they have lost a lot of credibility in their ability to be able to execute on even the basics here. So I'm very curious to see what happens. I think their event is on the 9th. And so maybe we can cover it next week. But
Yeah, definitely.
but I'm curious to see where it goes.
Well, I even wonder, are they in a position where they might be better off buying one of the smaller LLM vendors in the market rather than partnering with one of the big ones? And it would appear from this headline yesterday that they're at least the posturing says we're going to partner with one of the big ones instead. But we'll see. They can change.
It will probably be some of both, right? Like you have to imagine that an organization their size, they've got their own models that they built and trained and run privately. They're going to partner with people. They're going to acquire some people. Like it probably is some of all of the above. But in terms of the user experience, I shouldn't care whether it's Gemini or this or that. And I kind of like what I initially didn't like what OpenAI did with GPT-5, where it would kind of pick and choose the models for you behind the scenes.
Right.
Um, I've kind of come to like it. I also think they've improved the tuning on it a little bit since day one. Um, I don't know. That's how I'd like my iPhone to work as well, where it arbitrages and triages what and who to send my request to. And I don't necessarily care that it's Gemini or Claude or something else. I just want it to work, and to
Yeah.
work consistently. And I think that would be a good first start.
Well, speaking of working and working consistently, there are some people at Salesforce that no longer are. And that was the second topic that we were going to talk about. So this happened Tuesday, I think it was, where Salesforce announced that they were able to lay off 4,000 of their customer support staff out of 9,000 and blamed the ever-growing presence of AI. You think this is legit, or is this Salesforce selling Salesforce?
Yeah, I couldn't tell if this was their business slowing down for a lot of the reasons we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah,
If people didn't listen to that, please go check it out, like and subscribe. But more companies sort of replacing using AI to generate the code to replace some of their core application stack, and and the economy and some of the weirdness there. Like, is their business just slowing down, and they're using that as an opportunity to trim some people, and at the same time advertise how great Agentforce is at being able to replace the core workloads of thousands of people. Knowing them, it's probably some combination of that.
sure.
Um, Benioff has been a master marketer and creator of narrative over the years, and this fits well with his view of the world. But um, I do think that we are at a point where there are very likely many jobs in frontline support type roles that can and probably should be automated away. Jobs that many of those people don't even enjoy doing. And I think that as long as the customer experience continues to improve, which has not been my experience yet with even sufficiently advanced AI support agents,
Sure.
um, then great. See if we can redeploy those people to work on more sophisticated customer problems, or to improve the customer experience, or to take care of backfills and attrition. But I don't know if they're just using AI as a crutch to be able to trim their workforce. I think I would look poorly on that.
The thing that gets me about stories like this is you'll get a story like this. Hey, we laid off a bunch of people and it was because of AI. And then the next article in the scroll is about how a high percentage of AI projects are failing. And those two things are seemingly at odds with one another. Is it so bad that all the projects are failing, or is it so awesome that we don't need people anymore? I mean, there's some nuance where, if you navigate the maze, both of those things can be true at the same time. But it feels like to me that we're going to reach an equilibrium in some way, and that a lot of the jobs will change. It hasn't been published yet. I worked on an edit this morning for a vibe coding session that I recorded a couple of weeks ago that'll go live, I think, next week. And as good as Claude Code is and as good as sub agents are, you still need somebody babysitting it because they can go off and do catastrophic things. You need to make sure that someone is watching what happens, evaluates it, does a course correction, and then continues. We're not yet to the point where a story like this, where you're saying it's good enough that we're laying people off. At least with software development, it's not to the point yet where it's so good we can start laying people off, but it's the people we have can be more productive. I mean, this has always been a productivity play here for me. And I guess the argument here is that at some point that productivity gets to the point where you don't need as many people, but then you start getting into Jevons paradox. And, should you take that gained productivity and cut costs, or should you use it to go tackle projects that you couldn't afford before? And I always think the latter, the folks that do the latter are really going after bigger market share and bigger revenues. And I would much prefer something like that than what you might do if you're just out to cut costs. Like, why are you even doing it?
Yeah. And it's convenient that it was that group of people that they cut when that is the product they're selling.
Yes.
And, it's like, yeah, okay, sure. I believe you, wink, wink. But at the same time, it's really unfortunate for those 4,000 people
Certainly.
who and I'm not saying this is the case, but it could be that they're essentially being used as a marketing tool.
It
And
could
if
be.
that's the case, that sucks.
Well, and like you said before, being able to tell the signal from the noise here, the
Very hard.
economy is so complicated right now that it's hard to tell. I don't know how you definitively say I laid these people off because of AI, as opposed to, hey, here's these other 12 things that are going on in my business and they all contribute in one way or another. Like you just said, it was awfully convenient that it happened to be in an area that is part of the product that they sell.
Mm-hmm.
So something else happened on Tuesday, and that was that Anthropic raised another funding round. So they raised another $13 billion. Let me get my notes right. $13 billion. So they now have $27.3 billion across 14 rounds, and that's against a revenue number of about $5 billion that we talked about a couple episodes ago. This gives them a valuation of $183 billion. So what's your reaction to that new funding round?
My reaction is, how much equity do the founders still hold at this point? 14 rounds, 180 post money. They're just continuing to chop away. And yes, when your valuation is that high, you don't need to hold a whole lot of it for it to be worth a whole lot. But this goes back a couple episodes for us of just the cost of continuing to be innovative in this space, and how hard it will be for folks like Anthropic to keep up with the Googles of the world, who have more or less infinite money to be able to put against this problem.
The thing that struck
Do
me,
you sorry, do you feel like that valuation fits the reality for their business and the opportunity?
I don't know that we know what the reality is. I think I would much rather be sitting at Anthropic than at OpenAI right now. And most of the reasons have to do not with the core technology, but some of the macroeconomics. Anthropic isn't constantly being sued by Elon Musk. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, Anthropic doesn't have to untangle the legal side over, the original OpenAI I guess it's like corporate compact or whatever it is, that establish them as a nonprofit that they're trying to back out of so that they can continue to do. So there's some things like that make it, almost like I'll call it being second to market was an advantage for Anthropic because they got to see what OpenAI did well and didn't do well, and then go all in on the things that they did do well. And as we discussed, even in the first episode, they seem to have found a niche with developers and developer productivity and are going all in on that. And that's where the bulk of that $5 billion in revenue is coming from. I did a little exercise, and it turns out that the funding to revenue ratio that Anthropic now has is exactly the same to the 100th of what Snowflake's was at IPO. And that can't be a mistake. Now it's at a way bigger scale. So maybe that doesn't matter. And the part of me that is hesitant about this, we haven't seen this scale before. And to that point, if you go look at the press release on the Anthropic blog, it's like 16 different companies contributed to the funding round because nobody's got 13 billion sitting around, right? They had to collect it from a pretty wide variety of sources. And I think to your point a minute ago, if you're collecting from that wide variety of sources, they're all going to want some equity. And what does the founder equity look like at this point? So, in some ways, this looks a little bit like Snowflake because of that funding to revenue ratio. But in other ways, this, what they're doing and what OpenAI is doing doesn't look like anything we've ever seen before because of just because of how big the numbers are.
Yeah. Oh. What is this like a series? Did they give it a letter? Like what?
Nope.
What do they even call this?
They called it Series F.
Okay.
And I'm going to count it. Let's see. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So if you enjoy listening to me count, this is the podcast for you. And it's 22 different funders, including the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which is like the one that sticks out like, wait a minute, what?
Which is interesting because most public school districts don't allow their students to use AI. But they want to profit. The pension fund wants to profit from it.
Why
So
not?
let's go. Yeah, you do have to wonder, at some point the revenue opportunity at least has to start to catch up with the valuation.
Yeah.
And I don't imagine that a Series F is all the money they're ever going to need to
True.
get to like true profitability. And I don't know. I really would. I'm curious what comes next. I'm looking at the numbers over here, and it's just like staggeringly large, but in a market that I think even the smartest analysts right now have difficulty quantifying what the TAM is. Like the TAM is potentially equal to almost all IT spend excluding hardware.
Yeah.
If you want to think about it that way. And the productivity cost and reality of like, I don't know, 30% of the global workforce that's doing knowledge work or like there's just so much potential. If we look 10 or 20 years out from now, which is the time horizon that a lot of investors are thinking, a decade, what is the revenue potential if this takes off the way it could? And it's like nearly infinite, like redefining global GDP at the same time. So I don't know. It's hard math, but it's 183 billion valuation for a company making 5 billion in revenue. Sort of shows how bullish people are.
Yeah. And there comes a point where, like you just said, for their next funding round, who are they going to get? Like whatever the next funding round is going to be, it'll be more than 13 billion. It'll probably be in the next 24 months. Even if they're IPOing in 24 months, they're going to need one more round to handle the burn rate. Who else is left that has that kind of cash that they could get a round from? When you start to get into numbers this big, I mean, this is not like a $300 million round or even a $10 million round. If you need to go raise 20 billion and you've already raised 27, who even has that money anymore? You might be looking at governments, right? Like that's where you might have to get creative with the funding.
Well, Apple generated 96 billion in cash flow over the past year. And we talked about how they need some AI help. So 96 billion in cash flow. Their stock is reasonably frothy these days still. So I don't know. Maybe Anthropic just slides right in there to Apple Park and off we go.
Maybe they do. Let's get in one more story here because there was something that happened after we recorded last week that's related to this Anthropic round that we just talked about. It was not a mistake that Anthropic released what I'm going to call a white paper. They called it, I think, a report about the concept of vibe hacking, and that they did that prior to announcing their funding round. Like I said, I don't think it's a mistake. I read the entire 27-page white paper. I'm guessing you just saw the headline. Sort of, I guess, what sort of penetrated your consciousness on it? What did you hear about this? And do you have any opening thoughts before I talk about some of the details in the paper itself?
My thoughts at a macro level on vibe hacking is it's a fun term. I think even the least sophisticated, commercially inclined hackers have been using AI for quite a while, and that's not anything new. So again, as someone who hasn't read the paper compared to someone who read all 27 pages, I am curious to learn, what they learned and what they're sharing. But I don't know. My reaction is that like any hacker worth their salt that's not using AI at this point is a pretty crappy hacker.
Well, I was on planes this week. That's my excuse for having read all 27 pages of it. So the report really lays out three styles of what they call attacks. The one that was the most interesting and got the most headlines was what they called vibe hacking, which I'll talk about in more detail. The second one explored this idea of what they called North Korean remote worker fraud. And this is the kind of thing we've seen in interviewing for a long, long time, that people in North Korea were using VPN and they were using Claude to generate resumes and to generate CV and history. And then when they got interviews, they were then VPNing to obscure where their actual location was and getting multiple jobs through that route. The third thing that they talked about was using Claude Code to generate malware. And so part of the broad announcement was, hey, everybody, we fixed all three of these things. And that what they did was they put more in their pipeline. And historically, when the LLM vendors put things in their pipeline, they put it only in front of the user-facing, whether it's Claude Desktop or whether it's the ChatGPT, they only put it in front of that. You typically have raw access to the core model through the API. That's not what they did here. They put the pipelines in front of the core API as well, so that they're looking for things. And in all of these examples, like they showed the prompts or they showed versions of the prompts, like this is what we're looking for now. And you could argue whether, well, if you show your work, that shows people what doesn't work anymore, so now they're going to try something else. The one that got the most publicity, though, was this concept of vibe hacking. And what this person did was they did a series of prompts. And I based on the way it was worded, I think this was before subagents were introduced in July. I want to say that was. So I think they were doing this with a single Claude agent. So they had at their disposal a 200K token window. And so what they did is when you're using Claude Code at the command line, you can give it access to your bash shell. And as a result, it can any kind of command that you can run at your bash shell, Claude Code can now also run. So if you put that in a hacking context, they had a bunch of bash shell commands that they essentially coached Claude Code to go do to try to do some version of pen testing, and to do it in a way that they were impersonating the 17 companies that they attacked. They were impersonating the security teams of those companies to make it seem like they were doing legitimate pen testing. So they didn't use like social engineering where I if I'm remembering correctly, they weren't like calling people and getting passwords. It was, completely done with automation. But among the things that I saw sort of on LinkedIn and some other places were like, you could do this even more explicitly now if you have sub agents, because one of the reasons they started to go to sub agents was when you had the original Claude Code, you had that 200K context window. And once you exceeded that, you had to do a compacting or you had to do a clear. You had to clear the entire session and essentially start over. Then in July, they offered the sub agents, so you could give different system prompts to the individual sub agents, and then each sub agent gets its own 200K context window. So if you have what I think of as like the orchestrator agent and then like 4 sub agents, you now have 1,000,000 tokens to divvy up, because each one of those gets the 200K. And then they upped, like we talked about last week, they upped the context window size that if you're willing to pay more, you get 1,000,000 tokens. So now you went from having, one agent with 200K to like 6 weeks later, you could now have 5 agents all cooperating together and working in parallel and 5,000,000 tokens. So I thought it was nice of them to sort of lay out, like, take some responsibility for this is something we're monitoring and we're trying to do something about. Some of the examples were a little bit sort of toy examples and like maybe making it look like they're doing more than they are in anticipation of their funding round getting announced. But at least they're acknowledging this is a thing and have talked about that they have a full team that's working on it.
The marketing cynic in me hears that, and I think, why would they have shared that? Like, there is a security by obscurity, like not sharing what you do to protect the castle. Um, is always been for decades sort of a key part of how companies keep things secure, is that you're not going to always tell your attackers, here's exactly what we're doing to block you, and if you use these words you'll be stopped, but these other words not so much, right? And I do wonder if it's in part to help solidify in the minds of developers that read the 27 pages or saw the headlines, that like some of the smartest people in the world that have a choice of what models they use are using this one because it is the most sophisticated, it is the most advanced, right? Like, I think there's an undertone of that in what I just heard from you.
Yeah.
that like, comes across with that. There's not a lot of benefit to them releasing that information to the wild. They could have privately shared that with their counterparts at the other companies who are likely trying to challenge with the same problems. They all have back channels with each other for that reason. I don't know why they would have released it other than to show off the sophistication of their models.
Yeah, I mean, the more I read, the more I kept thinking, like, why are they laying out the map here for what you don't have to try anymore? And like I said, the timing was convenient in the same way, the Salesforce story that we talked about earlier was also convenient. But I think Anthropic does kind of have this, cool kid angle to it and appealing to developers in a way that you and I are familiar with. That, I don't know, it's part of it is like damned if you do, damned if you don't. like showing the community that we care about security. But did they go overboard for marketing's sake? Did they go overboard for other reasons? Like, it's hard to say. It was an interesting read, regardless. At least while I was, stuck in the Minneapolis Delta Lounge, it was. Um, it'll be interesting to see if Google or Anthropic follows suit, or if they hold their cards a little closer to the vest, because they have this exact same problem. They all have the same problem. Anything that's in that paper could have happened to any of those other vendors, and probably has happened to those other vendors. They just aren't talking about it.
Right. That's the thing. Is like it, it would really surprise me if one out of the, handful of large providers is the only one that this is happening to. But they're the ones that want to be seen as the most sophisticated for developers are the ones that went out and told the world about it.
And that was where there was a specific piece of language in the vibe coding section that made me realize, like, this happened 2 months ago. This didn't just happen. Because if it had happened after they released sub agents, the language that, like, there was a paragraph where they discussed how the prompts were created. And I thought, you wouldn't do that right now. You would break that up into sub agents, because the sub agents can run in parallel, and you could run multiple attacks simultaneously if you're clever about if you're clever about the prompt that you give the main orchestrating agent and the individual sub agents, you can get it to run things in parallel. And that would have been a logical thing for this attacker to do. And the fact that they didn't made me think, oh, this happened in like June, and they're just now writing about it.
Yeah, they had to give it all the legal and marketing polish it needed to be able to feel good publishing it.
Now that's how long do you think that process would take? Like, for legal to bless something like that, and having to go through fine tooth comb, and they probably had to review it with the 17 companies that were attacked as well. You would think, right? I mean, those people were all redacted. You didn't know who they were, but
Yeah. The security world is interesting, and I spent a good part of my career in and around that space. But there's this whole idea of like responsible disclosure, and I think there is a culture of um, rewarding people who get out early and often and share details about what's happening and what they're seeing and what they're doing about it. Um, and so I can't fault them for sharing what they see is working. Um, it's just interesting that they also shared what they're doing to protect against it, as
well,
opposed to just being more vague, as like, hey, we've noticed some of these sophisticated attacks in our latest models. We've put in precautions against that. They sounds like they really went into much more depth about what exactly people were doing, what exactly they're doing to prevent it, and so on.
it
That's
goes
that's
into
what's a
more
little odd to me.
it goes into more detail as to what people tried than what it was they were doing to counter it. So in defense of them a little bit, the standard line was, and we've improved our timeline so that this is no longer
Okay.
possible. Our
All
pipeline
right,
so that
so
this is no
so
longer
I'll
possible.
dial back my marketing skepticism a little bit here. Maybe they are just altruistic and trying to share their knowledge to the rest of the community, but um, they're also a company that's now valued at $180 billion and have high expectations from their investors. So every word that they put out is going to have, hopefully for them and their shareholders, gone through a marketing fine tuning, and I wouldn't expect this to be any different.
Well, it was, like I said, it was very much here's what they tried, and now that won't work.
Yeah.
The level of detail that they went into what they tried surprised me, and like I said, the length of time that had to have passed before they published it surprised me. But that was like, I guess it was at the SFO lounge at like 6 o'clock in the morning while I was waiting for my plane to board. So I could have done some misreading as well. Um, well, I think that's probably it for this week. Scott, thanks for the time. You and I are going to get to see each other live in 2 weeks, and I like that suggestion of we should record next week after Apple does some of its announcements.
Yeah, and then maybe the following one we'll try and do live and in person in the same room.
that'll be both a lot of fun and a logistical nightmare, I think. We'll cross that bridge when we see each other in New York in 2 weeks. And everybody else, thanks for watching and listening.
This has been the Old Guy AI podcast. Views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the sponsors or the employers of any hosts or guests.